everyone tells you that if your child is struggling emotionally, then you should find a good therapist. But therapy never really worked for my daughter, and I want to explain to you why and what I did instead. Welcome to the SEN Parent Survival Guide podcast, guiding you through the maze of SEN parenting. My name is Esther Freeman, and I teach parents the techniques and principles that help my daughter go from 5 or 6 meltdowns a day to virtually zero. Now, one of the key ways that I did that is through a practice called tapping. It's also sometimes called emotional freedom technique. And this combines the ancient Chinese tradition of acupuncture with Western psychotherapy. Now, I'm going to explain a little bit more about how tapping works in this podcast, but I want to say now that I've got some free tapping resources on my website, and I will put a link to those in the show notes so you can get started on this technique straight away. I also run workshops for parents to learn the technique face-to-face, either online or in person. So there's lots of free resources that you can access to get going with this. But let me just go back a little bit in time to 10 years ago when I was really struggling with my daughter's mental health. Now, if I could go back 10 years and speak to myself back then, I would say there are other alternatives to therapy. You don't have to keep going at something that either you can't access because of waiting lists or money, or just simply isn't working. Now, before I just get in and explain and tell my story, I want to just be really clear that if you are currently in therapy, if your child is in therapy and it is working for you, then absolutely you should continue with that. Never give up on something that's working. But, if you are struggling to get a therapist, if you are on the waiting list for CAMHS, that's the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, and you've been told that it's going to be a year, it's going to be 2 years, and you're thinking about maybe I should go private, and then you look at the prices and you think, oh my Lord, I don't know if I can afford that. Or, your child is in therapy and it isn't working. What I would say is just trust your gut instinct. You don't have to do therapy. It is not the golden goose. There are other things. And that is what I want to tell you about now. So my journey with tapping began a little while ago when I realised that one of the key things that I had to do in order to support my daughter's mental health was to work on my own mental health. Now, I was in therapy too, and to be honest, it wasn't working for me either. I was going every week and I was just venting, and I would come out just feeling exhausted and then just really stressed because I just lost quite a bit of my day and I had so many other things to do. You know what it's like, there's all the forms and trying to work and earn a bit of money to survive, and then you've got like the school run, the clock is ticking towards the school run, and I just come out feeling more stressed. And it just wasn't making any difference. And eventually I decided that I was done with therapy and that I was going to look for other things. And that is when someone said to me in a peer support group, have you ever tried tapping? So I went away and looked it up, and it described it as tapping of various parts of the body. So you tap on around the eyebrow and side of the eye. There are lots of different points. As I said, I've got these free resources which will explain exactly how you do tapping. And I'm going to admit, it's a bit kooky. And I just thought, well, what have I got to lose? Because I've been doing therapy for years now. I've been through about 5 or 6 therapists, and it's just not working for me. I'm often just coming out feeling worse. And I know people sometimes say, oh, it gets better, but it gets worse before it gets better. No, it didn't for me. It just got worse. I felt quite dysregulated after the sessions, and I just didn't feel anything was moving forward. So I thought, what have I got to lose? I might as well try it. So I sat down with a guided meditation similar to the one that I have on my website. I gave it a go. And I couldn't believe it. Within 10 minutes, I had significant reduction in my stress levels. And I just thought, this is amazing, because I've tried so many different things, as well as talk therapy. I tried all sorts of other things, and none of them were working for me. And I kind of considered myself a bit treatment resistant, but this worked in 10 minutes, and I was completely converted. And ever since then, it's become part of my daily routine. I do it before I get up in the morning, before I wake up my daughter, so that I know that when I'm going into that room, I'm not bringing any stress or tension or anxiety into the room with me. And I know that that will help her stay calm as well. So as I said, my daughter was also in therapy, and we were not having a good time with that either. We had gone for private therapy, and it was exhausting, and she often came out of it more dysregulated than when we'd gone in. And looking back, I can see what the problems were now. There was a big disruption to the routine, so I would have to go into school and pick her up, so it was disrupting her school routine. She's not a big fan of school, but it is still a routine that gives her consistency and predictability. And me going in and taking her out was disrupting that routine. It also meant that we had way more transitions in the day, because I'd have to pick her up from school. We would have to get on a bus and travel over there. And it wasn't exactly close, because we were going to the people that I thought was best. And so there was all these kind of transitions with the bus journey. And then we were going into a room that was unfamiliar with her. And I wish I could say that after, I think we did the therapy for about, the first lot anyway, for about 9 months. I guess she got a little bit more used to the room, but she still struggled with the relationship with the therapist, because for my daughter, relationships with adults take a really long time to develop. And as a result, she just felt really stressed out, because she was in this room with this person that she didn't really know. And so her stress levels were just super, super high. The other thing I will say about traditional talk therapy is not many traditional talk therapists are trained in neurodivergency. It's not a standard part of the training. There are some people who specialize in this. And if you are determined that you really want to give therapy a go and you have a neurodivergent child, I really would urge you to try and find someone who is trained in the neurodivergent child. Because I felt my therapist just didn't really, my daughter's therapist, she just didn't seem to really understand her. She kept saying things to her that I could see were really triggering her. And I also didn't feel like she was listening to me. So eventually I just said, I think I've had enough of this. And so I said to the therapist, I don't think we're getting anywhere. And she said, well, you just haven't given it long enough. And I was just like, well, we've been doing it 9 months, and I think that's long enough. And I just don't feel that she's making any progress. And then if anything, she's getting worse. And the therapist became quite defensive, I'm sorry to say. And I started to doubt myself. I just thought, she kept saying, no, I can see progress. I could definitely see progress. I think she was just trying to save face, basically. And again, if I could go back 10 years, I would just say, trust your instinct. You know your child best. And if you feel this isn't working, then change. Do something else. So I know some of you might be thinking, well, maybe that was just not a very good therapist. And that might be true, but this was not the only therapist that my daughter went to, not the only therapy. I had more than one therapy experience that was also unsatisfactory. And I just started to come to the conclusion that therapy wasn't right for me, and I don't know that it's right for my daughter. Now, I don't want to blame the therapist. I know I probably sound like I am blaming them. I don't intend that. I know that they came to those sessions with the best of intentions, wanting to help us, wanting to see our family move forward. And all I'm saying is that it didn't work for us. And I just think it's important that people know that there are other options available and there are other things that you can do. So as I said before, if you are struggling on a waiting list, if you are struggling to afford the therapy fees, if you are in therapy and don't feel like you're making progress, you do have options. So as I explained, I'd started doing tapping on myself. At this stage, I hadn't started it with my daughter. It hadn't really occurred to me, to be honest. And then we went through this really tricky phase where she started getting really stressed in the evening. Now, my daughter has something that Gabor Mate, the leading trauma and child development expert, he calls it an emotional allergy. And that is when a child who is particularly sensitive because they may have neurodivergency or some other issues has a very strong physical reaction to stress. And that is what happens with my daughter. When she gets stressed, she feels it very physically and she feels it in her stomach, which again is very common with sensitive children. So she gets stomach cramps, she actually vomits from stress. Sometimes it could be loud noises, sometimes it could be just the overwhelm that's built up over the day. And this often happens at night. Nighttime is the biggest transition that a child does in the day. And it's also, they may have been holding a lot of things in during the day, and that is the time when they decide to actually release them because they're in a safe space with you. So my daughter was having a particularly bad evening and she was in the bathroom clutching her stomach, going, "It hurts, it hurts, it hurts," leaning over the toilet bowl, saying she was going to be sick any minute. And I was feeling a bit at the end of my tether because I didn't know what to do. This child just kept vomiting all the time from stress. And I felt very lost and not knowing how to move forward. And then I just suddenly thought, what if I try some tapping with her? So I said to her, come away from the bathroom for a moment and get back into bed and just lie down. And I want to try something with you. And I briefly explained to her what I was going to do. And I said, if at any point you feel uncomfortable with this, we can stop. And I think this is really important to do, particularly with neurodivergent children or any kind of sensitive child, because the introduction of something new can trigger even more dysregulation. So I gave her a little bit heads up and I said, this is something I've been doing on myself. I've found it very useful and I'd like to try it on you. So I got her to lay down and I started tapping around her body in all the tapping locations, and I started reciting some things. And at this point I was not trained in tapping and I didn't really know what I was doing, so I just made it up as I went along. And again, incredible results. In 10 minutes, she went from standing over the toilet, crying out in pain and clutching her stomach, to being fast asleep. No joke, she was fast asleep. And the next morning, she said to me, what was that thing that you did? And I said, well, it's called tapping, and it's been something that I've been using on myself, and I found it really helpful in dealing with my stress, and I just wondered if it might help you. Did it help you? And she said, I just couldn't keep my eyes open. And she said to me, did you just make that up? And I said, no, it's an ancient Chinese tradition, but if it's useful for you, we can carry on using it. And we pretty much used it every night ever since. And she says to me, will you do the tapping tonight? Because she knows it helps her. So the huge impact that this has had, not just on myself, but on my daughter, was what led me to want to share this with other parents who I know are parenting children with special educational needs and disabilities. In fact, there were several weeks where just if I passed someone on the street, I was like, oh my God, I've got to tell you about this thing. It was amazing. And then I thought maybe I should do this in a slightly more formal way rather than just grabbing random people on the streets. So I went away and I trained as a tapping practitioner so I could teach this to other parents. And as I said, if you follow the link in the show notes, you'll be able to download a free guided tapping meditation. And I also do workshops, and you can have a go at tapping. Now, I admit that it is quite kooky when you first hear about it, and you may have just been watching or listening to this and just thinking, what on earth is she going on about? But I would just say, give it a go. I would recommend that you start on yourself, and then you can just get familiar with how it works, and you can get familiar with the tapping points, and then you can just see, does it work for you? Is it helping you? Are you staying calmer when you go in and have interactions with your child that you know that are going to be stressful? And then if you are, see if your child will engage with it as well. Try it with them. So, why tapping and not talk therapy? Well, as I said, talk therapy may not be working. There are lots of reasons why it won't work, as I've outlined. You may not be able to access the talk therapy for financial or time reasons. And what I love about tapping is that it takes less than 10 minutes mostly, and it's free, and you can do it at home. No costly therapy fees. Now, you might be wondering, but how do I know it's going to work as well as talk therapy? There's a whole range of evidence behind talk therapy that says it does work, and I'm not denying that. I'm just saying that that wasn't my experience, and it wasn't my daughter's experience, and I think there are logical reasons for that when you have a neurodivergent child. By the way, when you see these studies that say things like CBT work, they often haven't included neurodivergent children in those studies. In fact, they sometimes deliberately exclude them because neurodivergent children skew the results of these kind of studies. So always take them with a pinch of salt. Now, tapping is a relatively new therapeutic practice. So there just isn't the kind of evidence that you would have for CBT, but it is growing. So last I heard, there was over 200 studies that have been looking into tapping, understanding why it works, trying it with different groups of people. And what I can tell you is that the results are really impressive. So they've used it with people with PTSD, and they found within 6 sessions there are significant benefits. There's a significant reduction in their symptoms. They've even tried it with people in Rwanda who survived the genocide over there, and also saw very significant results. They've also done MRI scans that show that there are changes in the activity in the brain with people who they've had a control group of people who haven't done tapping, they've had another control group with people who have done tapping, and they can see that there are changes in the way the brain is working. And so just to give you a little bit of information about how tapping works. Now, the Chinese have this theory of something that's called the meridian pathway. And this is how they say energy flows around our body. So it flows right through our body. And at some points in our body, this meridian pathway flows closer to the skin. And at these points is where we can access that energy flow. So these are the points where you would stick needles in if you were doing acupuncture, but with tapping, it's where you tap. And what studies have shown is that when you stimulate these points, it actually sends a message to the brain that tells you that you are safe, and it shuts down the bits of the brain that have become activated in a fear response, and it actually shuts those down. And once those have become shut down, other bits of the brain can come back online, and there are things like memory and logical thinking. So this is what happens when your child is having a meltdown, that their fear response has shut down logical thinking, and it's just working from this very primitive part of the brain. And what tapping will do is just shut down those fear parts of the brain so your logical brain can come back online. Having said that, you cannot use this when your child is in the middle of a meltdown. but you can use it in the lead up to a meltdown, or you can use it as a trigger point, such as bedtimes, the school run, when you know that their stress is going to be high, and you will see results. I want you to give you a try, because I do think you will see results. So as I said, there are studies. We are starting to understand a little bit more about why it's working. I should also say that there's been some new studies that have come out that seems to help us understand what the meridian pathway is. It seems to link up with some theories in Western science. Now, I'm not saying that scientific knowledge is only justified if it could be explained by Western scientists, but it is interesting that Western scientists have discovered something called the interstitium, which is a pathway around our body that seems to link our major organs through a kind of network of cells, and they think that this might be what the Chinese call the meridian pathway. So it's just kind of interesting that both have found these things. So that's roughly how it works. There is growing evidence. In fact, there is one study that showed that tapping worked often better than a lot of other therapies, and when compared to CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, which is often seen as the gold standard, that it performed as well. And the one benefit that tapping had over CBT was that it needed less sessions, so you don't need to do it for as long, and you often find that the results last longer as well. So that's some ideas for you if you feel that talk therapy is not a route for you to go down. I want to just say there are other options. One of the most powerful relationships known to man is not the relationship between the child and the therapist. It's the relationship between the parent and the child. And if you can role model to them good self-care practices like tapping, then you are already well on your way. So that's my little tour around therapeutic techniques that you might want to try if you are struggling with traditional talk therapy in any way. And I wanted to end, as I did last time, to talk a little bit about the wider issues going on. And I thought that this would be a good week to talk about therapy and talk therapy and comparing it to other things, because next week is Mental Health Week. And I also discovered next week is Year 6 SATS Week. I don't know if that's just some kind of cruel irony that they've stuck those two things together. So this might be a really good time. If you have a child who's heading towards SATS, who's feeling really stressed about it, this might be a really good time to give tapping a go. You could try it before school in the morning. As I said, got those free resources on my website. There's a link in the show notes. Download those, give it a go, try it with your child, and see if it's helping them to go into their SATs a little bit calmer. But just to take a little sidestep for a moment, because I want people to understand a little bit more about your rights with SATs, because I don't think people always understand this. So if your child is really struggling with their mental health and SATs is making it worse, you do have a right to ask to be excused from them. The schools don't necessarily like it, and I have heard that a friend of mine had a child who went up into secondary school who hadn't done the SATs, and it seemed to send everyone into a tiz. But the important thing is that you prioritise your child's mental health, and you do have a legal right to say, I need to withdraw my child from these SATs because they are struggling with their mental health. Also, if your child is performing well below the age expected standards, they shouldn't have to do SATs. That's not what they're testing. They're not meant to be testing those kids. So my child falls into that category. She's several years behind her peers. She won't be doing SATs next week although ironically she's struggling with feeling left out, but that's a whole other subject. So you don't have to force your child into doing SATs. If it's too much for them cognitively, if it is too much for them emotionally, they don't have to do them. So go and speak to the school SENCO if you are in that position and assert your rights. I'll see if I can find a little link to some legal information which I can put in the show notes that will give you a bit more information about SATs. So I hope that if you do have a child heading towards SATs next week, that it doesn't cloud Mental Health Week for them. And if you want to celebrate Mental Health Week in a different way, give tapping a try. I don't know what it's like where you are at the moment, but the sun is shining finally after some horrible wet, rainy days. So get out, get some of nature's therapy, absorb some of that sunshine. Take 10 minutes with a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, just sit outside and enjoy the sunshine and take some deep breaths and get yourself ready to get back on the horse that is Zen parenting. That's a very strange analogy to end with, but I will sign off there. Have a great week. I hope I've got you excited about tapping. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more before you dive in and actually give it a go, then you might like this video here. This will tell you about the tapping points, a bit more about the history and science behind it, so give it a watch.